Hey, and welcome back to the official YouTube channel for A16Z Games. My name is Lester, your host. I'm a partner here at the firm, leading content and gaming creators. Today's topic is around generative AI, or Gen AI. Generative AI has impacted many different creative fields, from film to TV to music, and now video games. I want to bring in two partners from within the firm to discuss this intersection of gaming and generative AI. Jack Soslow is a deal partner who is one of the deeper thinkers around many different emerging technologies such as AR, VR, XR, didn't know that was a thing, and now AI. Also joining us is John Lai. John is a general partner here at A16Z, working directly on the games team. John invests across many different areas, from studios to consumer and games to infrastructure, and has overall a great macro perspective on the way generative AI can both disrupt and move the gaming industry forward. If you like this conversation, please subscribe to the channel. Any support, feedback, comments would go a long way. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. For you all as listeners, this will be a half primer on what is generative AI, but also a discussion of like where we're at, some of the progress the technology has made, but also some of the controversy. So without getting too far into it, I do want to kick it over to you, Jack, to really set the stage. My first question when writing this podcast was really, what is generative AI and how does it differ from AI as we know it, as we feel it, as it has already infiltrated our lives? Like, where's the differentiation between AI and what I'll call Gen AI?
Awesome. So generative AI is the use of neural networks to generate novel data. And what these neural networks are essentially is just mathematical abstractions of the human mind. It's just really a bunch of matrix multiplications and a few nonlinearities between them in order to essentially learn any domain. In the case of generative AI, it is usually confined to self-supervised models in specific domains where the goal is to understand the latent structure of the data set that it is being trained on. Say, for example, in the case of GPT-3, the goal is to understand exactly what is going on in the text world and text domain itself. In the case of DALL-E, the goal is to understand how to generate any possible image within the world. The way these models learn is through a process called gradient descent. They essentially start from random noise and then over time compare their generations to what it should have been, and then slowly learn the underlying structure of what is going on. There is a common misconception around these models that they don't actually understand. They are essentially making real representations of what is going on in the world. So, for example, you could ask it anything that it hasn't seen in its data set before. Say, for example, Lester, you had a good example yesterday of hot dogs flying in nacho cheese sauce. And that image should not exist on the internet, but a model could conceive of essentially a hot dog, nacho cheese sauce, and what it might look like to be flying within it. These models also understand a lot about the world that you wouldn't expect. For example, text models are really a good base actually for image models. So if you wanted to train an image model from random noise, it actually performs worse than training it on GPT-J as a base. So what that means is that it's actually learning from the textual domain what images look like in their construct, which is crazy. Also, what these models can't really do is extrapolate super well. So if you ask them, say, to figure out how to write a sonnet, it can't, like GPT-3 can't actually understand, say, spectrogram data or audio data or image data. But what it can do is it can kind of like figure it out if you turn that spectrogram into text. So if you say, hey, write me a sonnet, and these are the notes, and those notes have existed in, say, like constructions online in the past, then it can kind of figure out the pattern of what's going on with writing songs. But it won't, for example, understand what the word fiato means. So how does generative AI differ than traditional AI, like how you may have noted in the past? There have been kind of three phases of AI, in my opinion. There was this kind of first phase, which was expert systems. These are essentially procedurally crafted scripts written by experts in a specific space. A great example of this might be Deep Blue, which was the first chess AI that was ever built that beat humans in chess. What it really was a glorified search function. And it was a search function that was optimizing for points in chess over time to increase the probability of winning. And those points were decided by experts. Essentially, a queen is worth 5, or a queen's worth 10, and a knight and bishop are worth 3. In reality, like a real neural network has different context around the points for chess pieces that are different at each stage in the game. So you can understand how probably a just basic expert system is inferior to a neural network. And the second generation of neural networks were things like vertical AI. Vertical AI is essentially taking a data set and applying it to a specific use case. These would be things like self-driving cars, or recommendation systems, or moderation systems, where you had a data set and you wanted to train an AI to solve that specific use case. And then generative AI is the use of AI to solve many, many use cases in this particular domain. So one model, one domain. In the case of GPT-3, it can solve, say, writing poetry, writing code, writing emojis, writing ASCII, like pictures. It can do a million things in the domain of text. Versus, say, like a vertical AI can only do one thing.
I was also just going to add on to that and say that I think it's really fascinating to think about the history of AI in games specifically as well, right? Because if you think about video games, like AI has been there, like rudimentary forms of AI have been there ever since the very beginning, right? Like, and like when you play like Super Mario Brothers, right? Like all of the little Goombas, like the enemies, are running on a script, but the script is being, executed by a computer. It's not actually like, you don't actually have human players that are like, moving things around. And then you fast forward a number of years, and then Deep Blue and like all of these AI models are also being trained to play like StarCraft, for example, right? And so there are all these games for which an AI model was actually trained on playing video games as part of like one of the ways that they got smarter and smarter. And then like one of the ways that you get better at Valorant or like League of Legends is that you play against bots, which are basically rudimentary sort of AI models that a programmer writes a set of scripts that dictate what each of these characters do in the video game. And so I think like for most, it's really fascinating that for most of the history of video games, like AI has already been there. We just haven't like thought about it as like AI. And I think what's really exciting today is that with generative AI, it feels like we can take a bunch of stuff that we've previously been doing and we can turbocharge it and take it into like the next level, right? And so, yeah, so it's like both old and it's also new as well, if that makes sense.
Oh, I think about this all the time. My whole life has been a simulation battling against the AI in video games. I feel like mastering the system
Right.
has been this long, 34-year exercise in figuring out how the programmers have built models to combat human intuition and have designed games purely around, how can an AI outsmart an actual player? And I think it's now getting into an interesting spot, especially in the evolution of video games, where it turns into like a box where there's a bunch of pieces and there's, to your point, Jack, a bunch of kind of data points that can construct a very expert AI. But what's interesting is that games are moving into a place also around a concept of UGC, where worlds themselves can be built within games, where it's not really about the rule set and the pieces within the box, but almost giving players additional pieces or additional tools to make their own games from the actual base set of models, which I think we'll touch on a little bit before I can go very abstract very quickly. So I'm going to rein it in. Just another table setting question for you all. Where are we really in the timeline of generative AI? I know right now it seems like it's in a fever pitch. There are so many, profile picture producing apps. There are good and bad cases of ChatGPT writing essays and beating standardized tests. It feels like all of a sudden there has been this consumer boom, but I'm actually more curious about, is this technology that has already existed for a handful of years and just now have folks figured out an actual application for the technology? Or is this in fact like, no, this is being built right now. People are also figuring out how to apply it. And maybe over to you, Jack, if you want to kind of give us a little bit of a history of like how we got here and where we're at.
Yeah. So the real inception of the generative AI space started in 2017 with the release of the Attention is All You Need paper, which introduced transformers into the world. And then it took a few years for, say, like GPT-1, GPT-2, GPT-3 to come out. And GPT-3 was essentially at this point where it understood text enough where people could make real applications atop of it. It was a great foundation for essentially more companies to be built. GPT-3 was released in 2020, and then it took about a year for venture-ready businesses to be built atop of GPT-3. Those are going to be things like Jasper AI or Copy AI or a lot of chatbots that are using these foundation models as a base. And then insert 2022, when we just had this image model craze. Started really with DALL-E 2, then Midjourney, then Stable Diffusion. But this was the real breakthrough moment. Generative AI almost had this gradually then suddenly moment where it was just like increasing progressively over time. And then once the image models hit, it really captured the consumer zeitgeist and exploded. Say Midjourney is the most popular Discord in the world. Stable Diffusion is the fastest growing open source repo in the world. I think like Hugging Face recently surpassed Bitcoin in terms of GitHub stars. So like these things are growing very quickly. And it was because of this image generation moment. And what's interesting now, though, is that new technologies come with essentially like a life cycle. So Carlota Perez has this very interesting book called the life cycle of technological revolutions. And it goes through the installation phase and deployment phase of new technologies. The installation phase is essentially this eruption of new technology, and then some of these early use cases starting to be informed, followed by a bubble, a crash, and then the real deployment and golden age. If I had to guess, I think that right now generative AI is right at the eruption of use cases, followed by a quick bubble, then a crash, then the golden age of deployment. The thing is that like, why are we excited about it? I think there's a lot of really good reasons to be excited about it. I mean, it's essentially the commoditization of intelligence. So, and plus the rate of innovation is so quick. Essentially what's happening is like, you've seen the Moore's law and you've seen the papers just like go up and to the right exponentially over time. So our guess is essentially that this technological cycle will be very quick. The bubble will come, it will go, and then the deployment will be rapid. We are seeing almost every company we're using start to implement generative AI in interesting ways, and it's helping them out, like literally automating so many processes. And people are starting to use it as second brains. So where are we currently? It's like it has this craze, it has this frenzy, but it will probably be succeeded by a crash. A small one and temporary one, which will then be succeeded by like this golden age of deployment.
I think it's interesting just to look at some of the traction, right? The actual numbers that are happening in the space right now, right? So, like the AI photo app Lensa, which is the one that's generating a lot of the profile pictures that Lester just talked about. I think it's the #1 top grossing app in like many countries, including the US right now. And like that happened, I think, in the span of like a week or two, right? It was like one of the fastest sort of growing apps just in terms of like revenue and mindshare. And then I read last night actually when I was preparing for this, a great article by Kevin Kelly at Wired that mentioned that there are 20 million AI generated images being created daily as of last month. And so I'm sure it's even higher now, which is just staggering when you think about just like the volume of images that people are generating. So it feels like there's like real sort of consumer traction in terms of just like what's happening in the consumer front. And then as Jack mentioned, like almost every developer that we talk to today, in games and also outside of games, is thinking about generative AI at least and like wants to learn more about it. And some of them are actually already integrating generative AI into their development pipeline and in some way, shape, or form. And very much agree with you, Jack, that I think like this is all going to happen in terms of like widespread adoption, like way faster than we think, right? Like if we think about like the last few major computing platforms that launched, so we've got like mobile and like VR and then Web3, just to name a few. I think like the interesting thing is that AI has some like very significant advantages over them that should speed adoption, right? And so unlike smartphones or VR, there's no hardware purchase required for consumers. This is just purely a software product in most cases. That should make it way easier for people to just, get their feet wet and just start like, experimenting. And unlike Web3, there are already like very obvious and practical consumer use cases. And there's no financial element that could slow things down because people need to connect a wallet or they need to transact money. You can just get right in and just start basically making, making essays on ChatGPT, for example, right? I'll mention that, like Web3, I think one of the biggest speed bumps, I think, on this journey is that we do need to figure out the legal and regulatory frameworks around AI, which have lagged behind the technology itself. And so things like how do we handle IP and copyright protection? If you put in a bunch of prompts in the Midjourney and it spits out something that looks suspiciously like Mickey Mouse. Like, what do you do about that? Or if you end up creating the character and then it goes into a book or a game or a video and it goes viral and you end up making a lot of money off of it, and then someone just copies that exact same character right now, like you have no protection, right? And so things like that, like user data privacy, like there are a bunch of artists that are upset right now because their work is being used to train AI models out in the public domain, and they feel like they're not being fairly compensated for that. There's a DEI component, so there's a bunch of stuff that still needs to be figured out. But I think the exciting thing is that it's early, as Jack mentioned. Things are progressing very quickly, and it feels like we can all play a role in shaping how those regulations and policies are determined going forward, which I think is the important thing.
No, it's a really good point. And to go forward, I almost want to go backwards, thinking about this point that we're in, that you call like an eruption period, Jack. I think a lot about how you framed up the foundations being built on kind of like the taxonomic or the codification of words and language, which then has turned into kind of distilling words and language from images, which is then turned into like a Midjourney or Stable Diffusion to pair the two together. And it's almost like this Frankensteining of different codified mediums that are now coming together in a way that is producing rich art, I would say. So between, and you didn't really touch on this, but I have looked at your market map and I know audio is around the corner. When you think about actual coding and stitching all these things together, that's probably also in the works. So as each kind of power unit comes on between audio and text and image and then video to some extent, the question I have is around the models actually being built, the foundational models that are ingesting or that are taking these signals. And John, to your point, as we talk about intellectual property or when we talk about where these sources are coming from, how should future builders think about this? How is it already existing? Because that feels like the source of where, all the magic happens, but when you rewind, it's all coming from some derivative source, pulling from some database and coming from, some area that's pulling source material. So I'm curious how these are being built and if that is kind of where some of the issues should be tackled head on.
Yeah. I feel like my prediction for what will end up happening is that I think you're right, Lester, that the data that you use to train models will quickly become a proprietary sort of data advantage for companies that have access to a bunch of assets and IP and just like stuff that they can use to train models, right? And so I think there was probably a world where, like, if you just look at games specifically in the games industry, you have game engines, right? So you have Unreal and Unity, which are like sort of like the two biggest ones. And then you have a whole fragmented landscape of sort of these smaller sort of in-house game engines like Frostbite from EA, which they use to build Battlefield, or CryEngine from Crytek, which Amazon has now acquired. And they were sort of built in-house and were used specifically for like their particular games, right? And so CryEngine was famous because they had a lot of like had a bunch of like hyper realistic like environments, inside of like the Crisis games. Or Frostbite was great because in Battlefield they needed a lot of like mass destruction where like everything is just blowing up on screen. And so each of these engines is sort of tailored for particular use cases. And so in a similar way, like we could see a future where companies basically are building their own in-house data sets specifically for model training. Just like the way developers rolled around in-house game engines today. And so that ends up becoming sort of like the competitive advantage that each company has. And then in similar fashion, you could see like a Unity type company also coming into being in the space, right? Where a third party company just starts acquiring the rights to different types of games, right? Like you could start off by acquiring like old games that people aren't playing anymore, or failed games, or stuff that was in production but got killed before launch. Like there's so many of these. And then you're acquiring them all just to build a massive data set for training. And then maybe you open source it or license out that data, and it becomes sort of like a common domain that everyone sort of like leverages in terms of training their data sets. So That's just a couple of ways I could see it happening, but like I think it's something that definitely needs to be figured out right now, and like we're sort of in the early stages of that.
What you bring up is a really interesting point. In the case of games, there's verticalization versus horizontalization. Like, what is going to be better in this generative AI world? Verticalization is you make your own models and you make the tools atop of the models and you make the game. Horizontalization is like somebody makes a point solution for generation, someone else makes the tools for the generation, and then you make the game, and then you kind of layer on that stack. I think this is going to be a similar dichotomy as to what you kind of elucidate, which is a lot of game studios might use Unity or Unreal, but the big studios, AAA studios, are going to be using their own bespoke engine that caters to their use cases exactly. This is really going to be, I think, a similar case with AI. In the case, there's going to be a foundation model, say, for example, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, what have you. And people are going to be making tools atop of them, say Lexica or Scenario.gg or Kadem or anything like that. And then people will be using those if they don't want to spend the absurd amount of money to develop their own models upfront. This, however, will be different for AAA studios. I think AAA studios are going to want to have engines that are bespoke for their own use cases. Or like not engines, but also like AI models catered exactly to their art style and generate exactly the way they want it. And because what we've seen with models in the past is there is such a strong interconnection between the tools atop of it and the underlying model, verticalization might make sense in the case of AI. For example, switching from Stable Diffusion V1 and Stable Diffusion V2 is a huge difference.
Right.
And everyone has to change their applications.
And how much does it cost to train one of these models? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think GPT-3 cost 10 million in training, and that was for the final production version. The cost has come down significantly since then. But you could conceive that they had like testing versions that also cost money. I think Stable Diffusion costs 500,000 to train, which is like considerably lower. The big issue, however, is like a technical skill and like time to develop them. So it's very easy for a software engineer to kind of pick up and play with the Stable Diffusion API. It is not easy for them to figure out how to make a diffusion model. This is a complex task. In the same way that it's easy for a gameplay engineer to go and use Unity, but it's difficult for them to actually make Unity from the ground up.
One is almost to presume, though, that studios in any kind of field, but specifically within games, would then put their eyes on hiring those that know actually how to utilize the technology and harness it for their own power versus just like a top layer application, but to use it in a way that like a whole team could be dedicated towards building the in-house tools for the engine then using Stable Diffusion or any other of the technologies. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think the actual skill set of learning how to use and build AI is like an important skill set that is increasing in importance rapidly. And I think there's going to be like a dichotomy there, which is like there are going to be people who really understand how to utilize the foundation models that are out there, fine tune them, deploy them, get the data for them, work on the pipelines for them, manage the assets of them. And then there are going to be people that know how to build the models themselves. Two totally distinct skill sets. Both are increasing in importance in today's society.
Jack, I think one of the things you mentioned recently, which I really like, is that you compared sort of like being AI fluent, or the case of just like knowing how to work with an AI, with basically being a skill that's on par of like knowing how to, use Unity or Blender, for example, right? And so if you think about it, it's like in the future, this will just be a toolkit that everyone is expected to know. Just like, if you're a game developer, like you're expected to know how to build in Unity or Unreal or whatever, particular game engine that you're using, for that particular game. You could see a world where in the future, like knowing how to use AI just becomes a component of every job, right? So like, what are your a customer support agent or a QA rep or, like a game developer, it just becomes part of your job. So.
Oh, I bet it's going to happen. So, I remember when I was in college applying for jobs, and you would write in proficient in Microsoft Suite and Adobe
right.
Suite and After Effects. I bet there's students right now that are probably graduating with extracurricular activities, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, ChatGPT outputs, right? It feels like it's just one of those like resume builder kind of skill sets to know.
Yeah. There's an interesting case where you got to wonder if you see a resume of a graduating student that has very good grades and they put down that they've been proficient in ChatGPT, you got to wonder, hey, how much of it was just that proficiency versus like, them studying hard and, doing their own homework. So.
It is an interesting topic. I mean, in the midst of developing this
Yeah.
podcast, AI or generative AI has reminded me how mediocre of a podcast host I actually was, because the output was so magical and so instantaneous that when I looked at the prompt how to write a generative AI and gaming podcast, the first 10 results were remarkable. I looked at them and I was sitting there and almost got a nose. I was like, man, I can't think of question even number 11. I don't know how to rewrite some of these questions even better. And that's probably, to the prompt, I think questions is probably great. I think there's other, like, I actually do want to pivot and kind of talk about, we've talked a lot about the progress. We've talked a lot about kind of the timeline and where we're at and how some of these features and technologies are already being integrated within games. I want to play a kind of the other side. And John, you hinted at it briefly, but I think, you both have authored market maps and blog posts and kind of like think pieces about this technology. As much progress and hopefulness as I do see on one hand, there's been, clear utility to builders. There's been kind of like a magical boom of kind of like production and capability. But then on the other side, there seems to be a group which thinks this is going to be dilutive to creativity, right? That this is going to birth the new age of shovelware and samey looking games that aren't special. That's one point. A second being that this is kind of displacing artists and artistry and what really is the creative field across, all mediums, audio, text, visual. And this is kind of a technology that's too powerful and I think at the core of it is kind of what you alluded to is theft, right? Like IP rights and theft, which are all very like serious, as much as technology can push forward, these seem to be the limitations, and where maybe that bubble that you alluded to, Jack, is what the pop could be. Can any of you guys or either of you guys speak to kind of that other side of what could be holding this technology back?
Yeah, let me take a first stab at this because this is at the top of my mind, given a bunch of comments in the tweet storm that I just wrote from very passionate people that were objecting to AI very strongly, and so I have I think there is there's a very fundamental thing that AI I think threatens, that I think is making the responses to this that just if you're an artist and you see sort of what's happening in Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, it's eliciting a reaction that I think is particularly strong. And my theory is that as humans, we all need a sense of purpose, right? And for many of us, work gives us that purpose. And so AI, in a way, is a very existential attack because it threatens to remove that sense of purpose, right? Like, what if my work, my craft as an artist gets devalued because AI can do it, better, faster, cheaper, all of the above, right? And so, Lester, to your point, this being a podcast host, this is probably something that defines you. Like, this is a skill, this is a craft, you've honed it over the years, you feel like it's part of your like identity, and then, oh man, like you just plugged into the ChatGPT and like the first 10 prompts was like better than the script that you came up with, right? And so I think it's very natural that when a new technology comes out that like sort of like rewrites sort of identities and sort of what people do, that there's like a very visceral sort of response to it. To specifically address, I think, the two questions that you brought up, which I think are very legitimate ones, right? Like, will AI sort of replace humans? And then two, sort of like, will this result in a wave of big, like, trashy derivative products, essentially? My personal view on the human replacement is no, like, AI will not replace human artists, at least not anytime soon. And it might take a step for creative activities, like making games. Like AI will be a tool that helps developers be more productive, right? Like iterate faster, prototype better, be more creative. And like a framework that I sort of use to think about this is that the AI tends to have the greatest potential where human judgment is noisy or prone to error, right? And so an example of that is like self-driving cars. Like the average human driver is like not that good of a driver. And so you could actually foresee a future where self-driving cars actually lowers the rate of accidents and collisions and is safer than like having human drivers. Chatbots for customer support, faster, more efficient than a call center that's looking up an encyclopedia to like, oh, like this customer has a return, is it within 30 days, et cetera, et cetera. Grading homework or processing tax returns. There's a right answer for that, right? And so, and you maybe wouldn't want the human to make a mistake in your tax return, and then you have to pay taxes that you're unfairly owed. I think where AI will be less helpful is in cases where human judgment is very valuable. And so, for example, creating art, writing a novel, like in those cases, like the AI will be more of a tool for helping humans. Calvin Kelly at Wired, which is the same piece that I referenced earlier, he actually made an even stronger case, which I like and I've been thinking a lot about, which is he argues that not only will no human artists be replaced due to AI, but the demand for art will grow due to AI. And the example that he used was that he studied the mechanical camera. Like when it first came out in the 1800s, people were afraid that it would kill human painters or illustrators. It's like, man, you have this magical machine, you hit a button and out pops an image, and it's even better than like what a painter could previously take like a week or months to make, right? But what ended up happening was that was not the case. Like the camera just expanded the use case for graphics. Like there were just more places that you could put graphics in before. And there was and Calvin even speculated that photographs might actually have like increased the demand for paintings. And you could imagine that people were more likely to buy a painting or an illustration of a place after they had seen a photograph, for example. And then just one more point in this front, which I thought was fascinating. You might have expected the number of professional photographers to fall, within the last decade as a smartphone became popular, right? Because the smartphone has a camera, which makes any of us, a photographer, essentially. But in fact, I think a study has shown that the number of photographers in the US has actually increased over the last decade, as opposed to declining. So people appreciated professional photography even more after trying their hand at it and realizing that it's actually a skill that's, it's a craft with a lot of soul and art. Just to bring it all around to back to the original question, I'm optimistic that the AI will not replace human artists, that it will be more of a tool for helping humans. And there was this upside case that Kevin Kelly explained where like demand for things that an AI can assist on will only grow over time, and not actually shrink or replace it. That makes sense.
The only thing I'll add, John, you hit the nail on the head. The only thing I'll add is they did a study with GitHub Copilot and software engineers. And GitHub Copilot is essentially a code generation model. It's autocomplete on steroids. What they found was that software engineers actually, their enjoyment with their job increased by 60 to 70% because they weren't going to Google context switching all the time. It was just a way for them to automate a lot of their basic tasks. In the case of art, similar things could happen. Do you want to create like the first draft of everything? Do you want to do all of the kind of like more or less like rote work that you don't want to do all the time? Probably not. And then additionally, it increased productivity by 55%. So it was a net benefit for software engineers on both productivity and on happiness with their job. And then the other tidbit is I would recommend, like, when it comes to the utmost potential of like what art could look like with AI, I really recommend looking at things like Nijijourney by Spellbrush and Midjourney. Essentially creates these magic anime pictures that are just unbelievably beautiful that I could not conceive like of happening without an AI in the loop. And then the skill was like literally created by an AI artist. And they're making beautiful pictures and it's like a real skill. So the ability for AI to make better things is already happening, or like human aided AI to make incredible pieces of creative work is already happening.
That resonates so much with me as a new time YouTuber and podcaster. I feel like the assistance of ChatGPT set the base level for me to then iterate on and be more creative. It's almost, again, beating the machine. I think my whole life, again, has been beating the machine. It's here's the output, here's the vanilla questions. How can I be smarter than that? Yeah. And I think it's inspired me also to do more content. It's set the base grounds for, okay, I can build on this now. I don't have to every week sit there and think like so laboriously on, spend 2 days maybe thinking about the most honed questions. So that resonates. And also on the fact of artistry, I remember when I was a kid, I would take Gundam model boxes and I would trace over the the picture of the Gundam model. And then I would show it to my friends and be like, hey, look at what I drew. And they'd be like, oh, that's so amazing. How did you draw that? I'm like, oh, from my head, totally. I'm a kid, like totally just have the skill set. But little did they know I was just tracing, but that gave me the conviction to then, oh, I should draw a little bit more. Here's the detail I should draw. And that kind of led me on to more just conviction and confidence. Again, probably, very far away from game design. I couldn't get there, but I do want to touch on that. Like, how are you guys seeing right now designers or builders, concept artists already utilizing this technology? I see a few Twitter threads around, hey, this is actually helping me as a creative get outside of the box. It's setting an art style, some modality of, thinking about how to start a new project. It's giving me the template for like what's potentially out there. How are you guys seeing existing builders, as you meet founders on a daily basis, actually utilizing the technology?
There's been a few really interesting ways so far. The first is just basic concept art. And this can be off the shelf model, Midjourney. You plug in utopic woods with a nice cabin and chimney, and you get something that really inspires you to go and create something new, or you use it as a template for essentially the first iteration of concept art. There are really good tools for this right now as well. Things like scenario.gg is on the mobile side, can help you concept art out game assets. The other angle is with a more, say, after concept art, you want low poly assets. Those are going to be things like Caden 3D, where they're using AI in order to turn, say, an image into a 3D asset. And what they're doing is they're using AI to generate the first kind of like draft of a 3D asset, and then they have, say, a 3D designer on the back end kind of polish it up so that it's game ready. This is another step. And then there are more things like texturing for an asset that is coming along, but we've yet to really see like a breakthrough use case there. But then eventually, like the holy grail is going from like text to 3D asset generation. And there are a few companies kind of noodling in this space. Imagine just kind of like Midjourney, but for 3D. The quality of the generations are not there yet, but they'll be there. It's a bet on the derivative. Like the AI is improving so rapidly, it will be there soon. So that's kind of what we're seeing just in production use cases right now.
I think that's spot on, Jack. And I think if I were to try to sort of take one level, to step up one level and try to categorize some of like the use cases that we're seeing, I would think about it in terms of like ideation, assistance, and personalization. And so I think, in the ideation front, it's exactly what Jack mentioned, right? Like people that are making concept art, that are trying to make, first draft of a marketing copy. I need a logo for my company or like an app icon. The AI is fantastic at basically like spitballing 10, 50, 100 of those, right? And you can choose the best one and kind of work off of that, and you can riff. And so the ideation part, I think, is here today, and that's what a lot of people are already doing. The assistance piece is similar to GitHub Copilot, which Jack just mentioned. So having an AI sort of analyze what we do and then help, based on whatever large data sets they have access to, benchmarking, so on and so forth. The special thing there is that unlike a human coach or an instructor, an AI coach is always available 24/7 whenever you need assistance, right? You could be coding at like 5 a.m. in the morning. GitHub Copilot's there, and it's like just as good as it is at like 5 p.m. On a weekday. And then the last piece, which I am personally like maybe the most excited about, is the personalization side, which is using the AI to move from curated content to actually generating content specifically for an individual user, right? And so if you think about what like Amazon, Spotify, and Netflix try to do, they try to personalize the product experience just based on like what you as a user do, right? They look at all of the songs that you listen to, and they'll recommend a just for you playlist. With generative AI, like the promise is that we can go beyond curation to generation. So instead of just listening to a curated playlist of songs like similar to the ones that you like, you could actually listen to music that's generated in real time based on, a set of inputs. So, time of day, location, who you're with, my mood. There's a startup called Boomy that's actually attempting to do exactly that with music, which is very exciting.
I think about that as UGC games that have had this boom in user-generated content experiences. Let's say a Roblox, a Fortnite creative, a GTA mod. And some of the kind of like state of where those games have gotten is the community sometimes can't find the best games. And it's this whole kind of race to the bottom method of how to get to the top of the charts. but in a means that doesn't feel organic or super tailored to the end user, where there's too much out there, hard to find what you like, and as a developer, very discouraging because you have to fight this additional battle of not only making something great, but then finding a way to get the user in front of the experience. So you touch on a really interesting point that I haven't thought about before around not only creation, but discovery, and how discovery could just be the simple, in the act of coding or in the taxonomy of like games, that'll actually help systems to create like a list of, hey, here's 5 Roblox games you might like, or here are 5 Fortnite experiences that because you played this, we're going to serve up these, these games you never would have thought to play.
I think discovery is definitely, it's funny that you brought that up because that was also one of the concerns that people had sort of when they thought about the AI created stuff and just saying, hey, like, it's just going to result in like a huge wave of just like trashy derivative, games or music or videos or art that basically just then like, buries the actual human created products that have a lot of soul and are actually like, handcrafted, right? But I think it's a legitimate concern. Like I'd say that like, right now, if you just look at what's happening in social media, right? Like people are flooding Twitter of just like, portraits that they've created using Lensa. And it's like, I can imagine if I'm a portrait artist, like that's bad for me, right? In the near term. I think ultimately, like, at least in the game sphere, like the way we think about that is humans, like human players are essentially going to be the final arbiters of what's a good game versus a bad game. And like we hope that like an AI will increase diversity of games that are created and in general increase the quality of games because now it's easier than ever to prototype and just make different things. I don't know, over the long run, players hopefully will benefit because they get better games, they get more games to choose from, and anything that gives players more choice and agency in an industry, I think will benefit the industry long term. And so, and then I'll just add that like discovery is a problem today, right? Like, Lester, you mentioned like Roblox, the App Store, right? Like if you're an app developer and you're building an iOS game, like you're releasing it into a sea of competition right now. It's not like there's like no competition for iOS games. There's like over 1 million games in the App Store alone. So if you make a crappy game, like no one's going to play it, even if it's like AI or not. And so I think that's already the state of being right now. And so um, against that sort of sea of competition, why not actually adopt the tool set which gives you sort of like superpowers in terms of iteration speed, the ability to experiment and be creative and just maximize your chances of actually making a hit, right? Is sort of the way I think about it. Yeah, does that make sense?
Oh, totally. I'm almost more encouraged, strangely, by combining what Jack said earlier about how, as the models are being built and as engines or new game engines are being built and building digital asset management or building kind of a library of assets, audio files, models, 2D, 3D, whatever it might be, this boom of creation at the lowest level might actually feed up into eventual consolidation and ingestion of many of these kind of code bases or assets, which then could then lead to the next bigger moment or bigger game that takes all of those into consideration. I'm trying to think of like the cascading
The analogy?
analogy of like, I mean, it's kind of a bottoms up it's like a bottoms up boom that could then help the bigger games get even bigger, or the forever games, which I want to talk about in a second, get even longer. And I'll actually just transition right there. I think right now, a lot of the quote unquote forever games, the generational games, the Minecrafts, even just like in traditional sense, like stick and ball games, chess, these games have existed because there's been mastery of, at least on like the competitive set, like chess or even StarCraft or League to some extent. There's a box and there's players and there's pieces, and the mastery and the endlessness is this kind of human ability to compute as many dynamic situations and scenarios as possible and to like master that. I think in the world of forever games, where games are getting to, it's all UGC creation, right? It's games that like the users will take a toolkit, whether it's Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite, whatever it might be, and just iterate infinitely. But those games too also have updates, right? There's shader updates, asset updates, there's been a history of many different instruments being put into the toolbox, and I'm curious how like where we go from here. Like, what excites you about the future of kind of forever games, and is there like a forever game or an endless game, if we may? We've gotten glimpses, right? We've gotten like the No Man's Sky, we've gotten the procedurally generated
Yeah.
worlds, but I don't feel like
Yeah.
anything is stuck just yet. Do you think we're on the cusp of something like this now with the technology?
I think so. And what you're asking is essentially like, what are the affordances of AI that creates a new type of game? It's essentially, it's like the delta between like old games and Minecraft's infinitely procedurally generated world, or say for example, like the vast content supply of Roblox, or like the novelty of every cool boss in Elden Ring. Like these things are now accessible to every game ever. So like, what does it look like with this on steroids? So there are a lot of things. I think the biggest thing are games like D&D, where you get the actual content that you want at a moment's notice in real time. So say, for example, if you're a DM, you might make rudimentary assets to increase the immersion of your game. Say, for example, you maybe have like, you have character sheets, or you have like a world for like a final boss battle, or maybe you have like an image of one in the town. What happens when the team goes into the basement and you don't actually have the asset for the basement? Or what happens when you fight like the mini boss and you don't have anything for the mini boss? What you could have is say like AI fill in the blanks, and then also kind of extend into any direction that you needed to. Say, for example, you beat the final boss, you thought that was where the campaign ended, but people wanted to keep going and you have no idea what to do.
Yeah.
So you have text generate you like an extension of the story. You have an image model like create like the assets for the extension of the story. And then you have people maybe in their VR headsets have it like populate like in real time.
I love that.
Those are the kinds of games that I'm
Yeah.
excited about. Yeah. And then there's like a whole bunch of new genres of games that I'm excited about. Say, for example, imagine, say, social deduction games like Among Us, but a lot of you're interacting with humans most of the time, but what happens when you're interacting with NPCs that have specific information about the humans that you can use to like deduce? Say, for example, a game of Clue, where you have to actually talk to the townspeople in the town and convince an NPC to tell you like what they know in order to deduce that like, Lester, you were the killer. Or say, for example, a horror game that's like personalized exactly to like your deepest, darkest fears. And they start saying your name like in the silence and whispering in your ear.
Oh goodness.
Like, these are the
That's
sorts of
terrifying.
games. Yeah. These are the sorts of games that I'm not excited about, or like I am very excited about. The one game that I'm super excited about are like games built for bots. So like bots have been second class citizens in games for the longest of times. Like RuneScape is trying to ban all its bots. Web3 games are trying to ban all their bots. What happens when you have a game that's built for bots? You make them first class citizens, and the real game is building better bots. And these bots kind of go off and they live their own life, like Sims 2, but next level. This is something like Dark Forest, for example, where the core of the game is like actually building mods for the game. And then whoever builds the best mods and amalgamates them in an interesting way is a really fun experience. So that's another type of genre that I'm excited about too. Yeah.
I was thinking of Westworld when you mentioned that last analogy, right? It's almost like it's like a theme park essentially, where all of the NPCs are actually AI characters, and then it's sort of like interacting with those characters, and then every once in a while, like you can actually make a new character and put it in and watch how they like build relationships with each other. So it's like The Sims kind of meets like an MMO sort of now on steroids, which is pretty exciting. And yeah, I think so. Plus one dot those ideas. I love those. And then for me, it's just like I feel like the personalization aspect really doesn't get talked about enough in like the AI domain right now. But just like um, David Holtz from Midjourney actually had a really good interview where he mentioned that the majority of Midjourney users today are actually generating images that are very personal in nature, right? And so he gave an example of like a user whose dog had recently died, and so then they generated a bunch of images of doggy heaven, just as a way of sort of like coming, sort of like mourning or coming to grips with like, with death essentially. Um, and so those images wouldn't have any significance for anyone else except for that particular user, right? And so I feel the power of AI is also in doing the same thing for games, is in making everyone's sort of gaming experience a personal journey. And I think when we get to that point, I think it'll be really magical where, you can imagine just double clicking on something that Jack said earlier, like an MMO where the world just changes dynamically around you based on what you decide to do. So maybe you spawn in a beach and then there's like a forest in front of you, but you don't actually like forests. You find them scary. So instead you like build a raft and you turn around and you like go sailing instead. And then you just like sail off and you just keep going. You just like never come back to land. And then the game would be able to like keep up with you. It would spawn interesting things in the water for you to handle. There's a shark that circles you. There's a volcanic island. Maybe you get further along, like pirates that try to take you down. And that's not how the game started. And that's probably not what you thought was going to happen. But like the AI was like able to keep up with you, right? And then even more powerfully, you can imagine how this would work in a multiplayer context where like Jack and I spawn on the island together. Jack loves animals. I like pirates. And so both of them get spawned and then we like kind of interact with each other, right? So, maybe they're like animalistic pirates or like cannibals or something like that, right? So.
John, can we make that game?
Let's do it. So.
I went with to lizards with pirate hats, and you went cannibal animal. Like you went the other direction. But I think that's the fun of it, right? It's the amalgamation of ideas, and I think
it's the hot dog and nacho cheese sauce,
which I'm still looking for. That was a very obscure reference, John. You probably had no. I was trying to get into Midjourney, and the prompt in the Discord was type in a few different words, and I thought something was going to be submitted, and I typed hot dog, flying, and cheese sauce. And I realized I was in the wrong Discord channel or something because everyone was just posting their real life pictures to like verify their identity for some reason. So it was like my terrible prompt amidst the sea of other people's selfies. Anyways, what you guys kind of touched on was probably the ways that generative AI can affect a whole breadth of different kinds of games, social games, tabletop games, individualized, even single player games. Personally, for me, the kind of like even lowest like kind of Jackbox games where people are already doing Pictionary and then judging each other's kind of crude drawings, but maybe just has some element of making that real. Like I think that at a very basic level could be a fun game, right? Where I'm like a terrible drawer with my finger or mouse, but it could make me great. So I think it really touches on the various kinds of like it's not really tailored to one specific vertical within games, and that's what gets me excited. I think we touched on a lot. I think the practicality needs to be mixed with considerations around the ethics, around the kind of artist in mind. I do think that the intellectual property, the way that these foundational models are taking, existing artistry and building it into their engines or their games is going to be very critical to the hopefully not as harsh a bubble that we could experience if you want to place this in the eruption timeline. I do think you guys touched on kind of the practical nature of how much this kind of costs or doesn't cost and what studios could be thinking about as they hire their next set of artists or designers, maybe considering a component of having an AI team or having a department that's, maybe incubating ideas purely powered by AI tools and solutions. So I'm excited. I personally am very excited for the future and really thank you guys for having, the thoughts and the courage to kind of put out so many different thoughts out there. I think this is a natural progression of where the technology, will go if successful and progressive. It'll be a balancing act of magic and then reality. But I think that is kind of the name of Gen AI. So thank you both for dropping in, giving us and hopefully the audience a bunch of thoughts about where we're at. And we'll close there. So hopefully one of many more conversations around the topic
Absolutely.
of generative AI.
Awesome.
Sweet. Thanks, Lester.
Have a good one.
Thank you so much.